Dear America, did you know that you made less money than you thought you did? We're going to talk about a benchmark revision. It's a sad story, but we're going to talk about it next with Jeff Snider, the head of global research. And this episode is sponsored by social media. You can find Jeff on Twitter at Jeff Snider with an I, _ AIP, also with an I. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Kalinowski, also 2 I's. Jeff, I'm not going to make any funny jokes because this is a sad one. We're going to talk about something that you never hear about in the mainstream media. That's how I should have started the show, is by telling people we're going to talk about something you don't hear about in the mainstream media that is extremely important. It's benchmark revisions. It's about going back in time and saying, you know what? It was actually much worse than we thought it was. But moving on. So, Jeff, the article. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it really, to me, it's one of my biggest pet peeves, is because you're exactly right. An economic number like today, the payroll number will come out and everybody will say, this is the economy. This is what it is. They don't realize that what you're actually being told is this is a limited snapshot of whatever government agency thinks is going on today, to a reasonable degree of accuracy. And that term I just used, reasonable degree of accuracy, is a term of art. And there's a lot of looseness in it that you don't realize is there. And so, yeah, the number comes out today and then it's quickly forgotten, and we never go back and think about, well, how close were they? Because they're just giving us sort of a range of, well, we think the economy could be doing this, but it could also be this. That's really what these high-frequency data accounts are saying. So we need to go back and check to see how close we actually were. Except nobody ever does that. I mean, obviously the statisticians do that because they do that all the time. But as far as the media goes, once a number comes out, that's the number that gets printed in people's memory, and it never changes. When in fact we've seen, especially since 2012, these benchmark data revisions sometimes are very substantial, to the point that they really do alter your picture of what happened in economic history. And this is one that we're going to talk about here. It doesn't just apply to economic history, it applies to this year economic history in a way, frankly, I don't think I remember ever seeing before. And it's a really serious one.
That's right. I circled the number of exclamatory adjectives here that you used in this report, which is unusual. Unlike you, you're really trying to drive this point home, and hopefully I can help do that on the show. Jeff, if people want to read the article, it's called Inflation Estimates, PCE, Totally Overshadowed by Benchmark Income Revisions and the Deflationary Implications of Them. So if the audience is out there and they heard this about this data release, it's almost certain, 99% chance, that it was just about the PCE number and not about the benchmark revisions. But it was very big, and you said...
Well, yeah, the PCE number we're referring to is the PCE Deflator, the inflation numbers, which, as I'm sure everybody is aware right now, they're elevated in a way. The core PCE is the highest it's been in 30 years, which I'm sure everybody has heard. But I'm equally sure that almost nobody has seen the rest of the data, including the revisions that we're going to talk about. And as I said in the title, what I was getting at is that down the road, the more important part of the data that was released at this time, the personal spending and income data, is this income data, not the deflator data.
So we're going to talk about real personal income, excluding transfer receipts. And why do we want to exclude transfer receipts? What are we driving the core of? What are we looking at?
We're looking at personal income, and that's including wages and salaries and earned income, as well as proprietor income and income from business, profits. What we're really looking for is, what is the private economy underlying fundamental in terms of income generation and distribution. We don't care about Uncle Sam throwing trillions in transfers and stipends and whatnot, because that's the non-economic factors that don't really tell us much about the private economy's health or ill health. So we want to use real personal income excluding transfers. And when I say we, I'm just talking about us, you and me, Emil. the NBER, for example, which we talked about in just a recent episode, when they get together to decide on a business cycle, they look at basically a couple different data points, GDP, the unemployment rate. They also use this one. This is an important data point that mainstream economists use to get a good sense, or at least a somewhat reasonable sense, of the private economy underlying income fundamentals.
And importantly, it's real, so it's inflation adjusted.
Exactly.
So it's, real stuff, real income, what people are earning. Jeff, I wonder if the NBER, which had just determined that the recession had ended, I wonder what they would have said, because they were looking, now I've pulled up a graph, they were looking at the black dashed line. I wonder if there would have been a pause, if there would have been a hitch in their step, if they had seen these new numbers. Now, Jeff, hold on to your seat, ladies and gentlemen, but this benchmark revision didn't go back a few years. It went all the way back to 1959. The whole thing was revised. And Jeff, did we see big changes all the way up and down, all the way throughout? Or when did we start seeing a revision, and which direction? Was it a revision upward? Glory, hallelujah. When did this, and what direction?
Well, I think, let's take a step back again. And what are we talking about with revisions? High frequency data is monthly data or even quarterly data where, the government or whatever agency, it doesn't have to be the government, it could be, like ADP doing a private survey. They have a manageable sample size that they can get through in a month, so that when the end of the month comes up, they can have an estimate ready. And so by just that necessity of time, the sample size has to be smaller than what they would consider ideal. That's why it's less accurate when they release these numbers. What they're really telling you isn't, this is the number of payrolls, or this is the number of actual income produced by the economy. What they're saying is we believe there's a range in which this number represents sort of an average. And then when they have time at the end of the year or in an annual process, and sometimes in a biannual or multi-annual process like the big economic survey, which comes around every 5 years, they take an enormous sample size and they say, okay, we can't do this on a high frequency basis, but we'll look at a much bigger sample size on an annual basis at least, and we'll check our work. We'll see how accurate those high frequency, low sample data estimates were. And a lot of times they really match up pretty well. There's always a little bit of wiggle room here and there, but as we've talked about before, there are certain periods where that doesn't work out as well, where when they get to the larger samples, these annual benchmark revisions, and they go back and look at the high frequency data and they're, whoa, we way overestimated the short run stuff. And it turns out when we look at a more comprehensive sample across the economy, there was a lot less economy than there was. And getting back to answer your question, Emil, that you just asked, Emil, it was right around 2016 where we see these latest benchmarks start to show up, and it shows up in the bad way, which means that, during globally synchronized growth, or what we call reflation number 3, in terms of real personal income, excluding transfer receipts, there wasn't as much income as we thought there was. It isn't a huge downward revision, but it's a substantial, significant downward revision where you start to think, okay, it wasn't all that great to begin with, and now it's even a little bit more, it's even a little bit less. So that kind of fits with the picture that the bond market was sending at the time when everybody was convinced of inflation, growth, everything's great. The bond market was saying, I'm not looking at data, I'm looking at the real economy, and it's probably not as good as people think. And then here we are years later, they come along, the BEA, and says, yeah, you know what? It wasn't as good as we thought it was. There's a little, it's not a huge difference, but it takes a little bit off that says, yeah, it wasn't as good as we thought it was.
Jeff, it wasn't good as they thought it was because the third Eurodollar crisis had erupted off the coast of China, and it was damaging terribly emerging markets, especially China. And we knew that 2015 was a weak year. You call it a near recession. Jeff, it's no coincidence in my mind that out of left field, an avowed socialist, Bernie Sanders, and an orange man, eventual President Trump, Donald Trump, all of a sudden came to the fore. Both of these are very odd, very strange birds you would not see in a normal situation, and here in your article, you say that near recession, hardly anyone knew was going on. Hardly anyone in charge or in the academic sphere or in the professional economics. But you know who did know? Real people. Something was wrong. We see it in this data, just this small little data set plus so many others. Okay, 2015, 2016, but it gets worse. Globally synchronized growth, 17, 18. I'm going to pull up this chart. We're starting to fall way off what we thought was happening in this latest revision and going up to even more recent times.
Yeah, and I think that's where we want to focus now is the latest revisions. If you look at that dashed line, that was what everybody thought this was going to be, or that's what everybody thought income was this year. And it wasn't until last month's numbers that we said, oh, wait a minute here. Where did all that income go? You know, we had the line going up in the right direction. It wasn't going up far and fast enough, but at least it was going up in the right direction. And now the BEA comes along and says, sorry, that income never happened. The economy that we thought was at least moving in the right direction to a recovery, here we are in real private income. You know, again, what we really want to see, the health of the real economy. And they're saying it's kind of, not only are we below February of 2020, or actually I think it's January 2020, which was the prior peak, we're not really moving that far upward either. You know, that little dip there was January, we had almost a recession there. Then we had the quote unquote cold winter of February blanketing Texas and all that stuff. And then we had a small rebound from it, not nearly as robust and as immense as previously thought. And that's where we're getting to in terms of how are we looking at the future. The future at that what we thought last month, that dashed black line is so much better. Even though it's still not recovery, it's so much closer to one than the thick red line of where we believe we are right now.
And Jeff and dear audience, if it isn't already just clear on this graph, that is a big difference. If it wasn't clear enough already, here are just some of the words I had to circle in your blog post. Totally, big, oh boy, very important, huge, oh boy, truly stunning. Quote, this might be one of the biggest downward revisions I've ever observed. And Jeff, we had already talked about downward revisions not too long ago in industrial production and retail sales, and now in the real personal stuff, the important stuff, income, real income. It's flat. It's been flat
since October. I mean, it's not just a month or two. We're kind of moving sideways, which sideways is recession. That's it's at least near recession. If you look at the numbers from both 2012 and more so 2015, 2016, you'll see the same thing where you have sideways to slightly lower, which is at least a near recession. That's income of a near recession. Now, we don't feel it because of the other stuff that's going on, the Uncle Sam's helicopters and transfer payments. But in the private economy, we're supposed to be seeing recovery. Again, as I said, the previous benchmarks, that dashed black line, that wasn't good enough either, but it was at least recovery-like. And you could see it moving in the right direction. This other is more recession-like. And that's completely different interpretation. It leads you into a completely different set of probabilities over the near-term future as well as beyond. And you start thinking about this in terms of bond yields, for example, it kind of makes sense where you think, okay, reflationary bond yields in January and February, the market's starting to think, well, maybe income is like the dashed line. But then at some point, the bond market realizing what's going on in the real economy, regardless of whether or not it gets captured in these economic statistics, that it wasn't acting that way. Real income, real economy, real labor market, it wasn't as robust as was being portrayed. And so what the BEA is doing is coming back and saying, yeah, that's true. That's accurate. What the bond market has been saying about its view of the real economy, we see it too in this immediate revision.
Thankfully, our monetary authorities pay attention to the bond market and take their clues and guidance from this complex system. Jeff, the second half of your article Just a summary, and we'll take it, we'll end the show. Just a summary, basically, that what you're seeing in these income figures suggests to you that the PCE numbers of deflator, inflation, will be transitory because you need income growth, wage growth, right?
Yeah,
Did I summarize it?
That chart with the revisions, I think we can translate into the inflation numbers. As we now know with the recent benchmarks, that thick red line that's going sideways, that's transitory inflation. And so what's driving the PCE deflator currently is what's not in the red line. And I don't mean the dashed line either, the black line. I'm talking about the transfer payments from Uncle Sam. And so once the transfer payments from Uncle Sam start to fade away here, there you go. Perfect example. It's the orange line where you see the PCE deflator and the CPI, but over time, it's the red line that will ultimately determine the longer run inflationary condition or potential. And that sideways red line is not inflationary in any sense of the word.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. And that's it from me. I got to work on I think I've been doing better on my intros. One day I'll work on the outros. How about you? Why don't you outro the show?
I'll do my outro, which is, yes, I'm going to send it back to you to do a closing remark.
Dear audience, we'll be back again next week. That's terrible, terrible. All right, well, let me spend a couple of minutes working on it, and then I'll get back to an outro. All right, Jeff, great show. I'll talk to you again next week.
Yeah, thanks, Emil.